We'll let you know when it's time for questions, but please do be thinking of things you'd like to ask our speakers, who are, of course, Ronen Steinke, a political commentator for the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is Germany's leading broadsheet newspaper. He's published a number of works in Germany on the Nazi period, including his biography of Fritz Bauer. We're also just talking about his new book about the question of fairness and inequality in the German justice system, which is making waves in Germany right now, very much part of the public discussion. So we're very pleased to have you with us, Ronan, to talk about, I guess, your last project, but it's of great interest to us here at Leobeck Institute. And in conversation with Ronen Steinke will be Sophie Spaan, who obtained her PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from the KU Leuven in Belgium. And her research examined Muslim religious institutions and European Islam policies in London, Berlin, and Paris in the interwar period. And if you saw the listing for this event, you'll see that she was the author a few years ago of a very interesting article about this period, Islam in interwar Europe in Foreign Policy, called When Europe Loved Islam. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, that will also, I think, help deepen your what you take away from today's discussion. And before we go any further, I just want to say that we will be sharing a discount code for Ronan's book, which we hope you'll all purchase and read. So I am going to turn it over to you now, Sophie, and I look forward to hearing from you both. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. And also thank you for the audience for being there and for having me. Good evening, I would say. I'm joining you from Amsterdam. I know that many of you are in other places all around the world, but I'm glad that you're here, and also to Ronan, of course. I really enjoyed reading this wonderful book, especially with my background. I think there were a lot of themes that I recognized in your work that also reflect aspects of my research, but I really enjoyed. It's a very vivid account of the times. And it's very lively. I like this idea. It makes you feel like you're walking around in the space as well, which is very, if you do a lot of archival research, sometimes, especially with a lot of government documents, it can get a little dry, but this really brings it to life. I wanted to start, well, I will explain a little bit of what we're going to do today. I wanted to delve into the story with you and ask you a lot of questions. And then we'll take about 45 minutes. We'll see how long it takes. And then indeed the audience will get to ask questions as well, because I'm sure there a lot of stuff will come up today. So I wanted to start with the kind of the origins of this story. So how did you come into contact with the story of Dr. Helmy and Anna, and what was it that made you decide you wanted to write about it?
I read a really short newspaper piece, maybe 2 paragraphs long, very brief, giving the account that Yad Vashem, which you all know is the official Holocaust Remembrance Institution of the State of Israel, had for the first time awarded the honor of Righteous Among the Nations to an Arab person. Righteous Among the Nations means somebody who risks their own life to save Jews from the Holocaust. And Yad Vashem has given this honor to 25,000 people already, among them a good number of Muslims. So that was not the novelty of this news, but for the first time, an Arab person. And that, for obvious political present day reasons, had a particular relevance and a particular sensitivity, and that made news and headlines. And even in Germany, that was a piece that ran in the newspaper. So I curiously started reading, and in the first couple of sentences, it said that the Arab gentleman who saved a Jewish family from the Holocaust, well, he performed his deeds in Berlin. So this to me was already surprising. I didn't know that Arabs were able to live and to live to such a degree of security that they were able to help others during the Nazi era. So that made me, that intrigued me. And then I continued reading, and it's interestingly said that Yad Vashem had reached out to the descendants, to the family of this courageous Arab person, an Egyptian doctor who well, passed away a number of years ago, but his family is still there. And the Egyptian family turned down the invitation. They said, no, they don't want to have anything to do with Yad Vashem, or to put it more bluntly, with Jews. And that kind of, in this small miniature, encapsulated so much of what once was evidently a degree of trust and of warm relations, and what today is, well, the inability even to shake hands, even to meet on such a like non-political issue as a humanitarian act that is several decades in the past. That really was unsettling to me, or was something that really got me thinking. And so what I did was I started to go to archives and to see whether I could learn more about this story and about the background. And then the next thing that I did was to board planes and visit the families, both on the Egyptian side and on the side of the Jewish family, which was saved. And this is a family which today lives in New York.
Well, that's clear, I think, and it makes sense that this captured your imagination so much, because a lot of that also has to do. I think Dr. Helmy arrived in Berlin in 1922, right? And in this period, which is also something that I wrote about, is that there's this very cosmopolitan, lively center of a lot of people who are thinking a lot about how they want to shape their future and how they want the future of Europe, what they want it to be like. And there's a lot of room for different ideologies and for different religions. And there's a lot of freedom in that sense, also for a lot of people to intermingle that normally maybe wouldn't come and get in touch with each other. Could you reflect a little bit on this kind of lively debate culture?
I want to kind of balance that with a little realpolitik, unromantic explanation. So why were there so many Arabs in Berlin at the time? Berlin had a huge Arab community, thousands of students who came here, who studied at German universities. Why? Why was this such a center of the Arab exile? The German state made an effort to attract them, to invite them. They were generous in giving grants to Arab men. It was only the men who were invited to come to university. The German regime, and this goes back to the days of the Kaiser, of the German emperor, styled itself as a friend of the Arab world and as the natural ally of Islam and all these things. In Berlin, there's a villa which was gifted to the Arab community, which still stands today, which was painted on the inside with camels and pyramids, which was kind of what the Germans thought the Arabs would like to have in their house. Why was the German regime so friendly to the Arab world? Well, the reason for that was, of course, power politics. The idea was to destabilize the French and the British colonial powers by empowering the Arab bourgeoisie, the rich upper middle class, and to enable them to take matters into their own hands and to demand self-determination in their countries. So this is the kind of the strategic goal that was secretly pursued by the German regime. And this is something that the Kaiser did. This is something that when democracy started in Germany in 1918, which the Weimar Republic then continued, and it was very successful. The community that was attracted to Berlin was highly educated. These were young men who did their doctorates in Berlin, who brought poetry, who brought music, who brought an interest in lots of things. There were 12 Arabic language magazines published in Berlin at the time. So this was really a cultural center. Berlin, in any case, was an interesting and attractive place. The Golden 20s. This was as you say, a place that was very open-minded and very open to cultural influences. And since the First World War had just finished, there was a young German generation of people who were so disillusioned with traditional European values and traditional European political concepts that they were open to anything else, basically. And this was a time when young Germans embraced other religions. People converted to Hinduism, to Buddhism, to Islam. This was a time when, well, today we would call them New Age literature really bloomed. Yeah, we've already heard briefly about Lev Nussimbaum, who was a best-selling author of the age. Well, if we read his novels today, they're very, well, new agey and not very serious. But this was kind of the spirit of the day. Yeah? People were experimenting with new art forms. Nudism was a big trend. And yeah, so for people who came to Berlin from Arab countries, this was a huge playground, and basically a population that was open-minded to them. And the interesting thing for me, looking at Arab-Jewish relations, is that of all the different kind of facets of the German social tapestry, the Jewish community was the Jewish minority was the one that was most open and most warm towards the Arab immigrants. And why is this? It's because there was a romantic memory of Andalusia, of the time when what is today Spain was under control of Arabs. This was remembered fondly as a time of like the golden age of Jewish culture. There's some truth to that. There's the kind of the background of that is that indeed in a time when Jews were regularly persecuted and were subjected to pogroms in the east of Europe, in Andalusia and under Arab rulership, Jews were not murdered at the same in the same way, but were treated as second-class citizens nonetheless. But the persecution was much less. So so this was kind of romanticized to really a positive view of anything Arab and anything Muslim. And I think, Sophie, it's your article in Foreign Policy that really phrased or that really coined a beautiful phrase. You compared the positive image that Islam had in Europe in those days with the image that Buddhism had in California in the 1980s. So, which is a beautiful way of saying we're not talking about a super deep theological analysis. We're talking about a zeitgeist. Yeah, we're talking about a trend of the day, and the trend of the 1920s was anything Islam, anything Arab was considered attractive and interesting.
I would say that I think my co-author Maria Hanoun coined that specific sentence, but still, yeah, I see what you mean, and I think that, well, everyone engaged to a different level, of course, with Islam and with the ideas people were speaking about. Some went a little bit deeper than others. Someone like Hugo Marcus, who you also talk about in the book, was quite highly educated in philosophy. So for him, I think it went further than the trend aspect.
We need to spend a couple of sentences on this person, because this is such a fascinating person. So in the 1920s, the first mosque that was that existed on German soil was in the south of Berlin. This was the only mosque, the only game in town. And who was the person who ran the mosque, who organized everyday life? Not the imam, not the theological leader, but the everyday organizer. And this was a Jewish person, Hugo Marcus, who had converted to Islam, or who had adopted Islam as his religion, but who interestingly insisted that he did not convert, because he explained that to adopt Islam does not mean abandoning anything of your own Jewish heritage, but rather it's adding a few centuries of wisdom and of literature to your horizon, like broadening your horizon. So he said that Islam is kind of a little more than Judaism. It's like an update to Judaism rather than a departure from Judaism, which I don't want to pass judgment whether that is theologically what we can think of, but it just serves to illustrate the spirit of the day. It was so friendly towards Islam, and there was such an openness, particularly within the Jewish community of Germany, that I really think living in the 20th century today, and today we're confronted with a very different image, and we're raised, at least I can say this, with this notion that Jews and Arabs are somehow naturally opposed to one another, or that there's something in the culture that is incompatible. It's really valuable, I think, to go back just this little step in history and to see how, 2, 3, 4 generations ago, people had a completely different perspective.
Yeah, that's always very valuable, I think, to go back, especially using these micro histories to look at a greater narrative. I would say that in this period in Berlin, there were also a lot of competing factions of different groups of Muslims. It was not all that everyone, but this is also something you write about. There's a lot of fluidity in the different groups that people attend, and your enemy is your friend is your enemy, that this goes around a little bit, and that it's flexible anyway. And that's also this idea of flexibility also comes up when Dr. Helmy works in the hospital. You call him a flexible opportunist. Could you elaborate on that? Because I think it's something that a lot of people at that time also were going through.
So Germany was open to immigration from Arab countries, but this does not mean Germany was any less racist and elitist and arrogant towards the Arab immigrants. The hospitals, the universities, all the places where these Arab doctoral students could see a career for themselves, this was very tough ground for them. And so what it ended up as was that the one hospital in Berlin where a talented medical student could see a career for himself and could rise through the ranks was the Jewish hospital. And this is where the protagonist of my story, who came to Berlin as a kid, basically right after school, studied medicine at university, where he got his break. He worked side by side with Jewish colleagues. He was supported and educated by a Jewish professor, and he really saw himself as somebody who really owed a debt of gratitude to the Jewish community.
And also in this period, we see that he also receives a lot of attention when he's working at the hospital, and later when it becomes more difficult, from the Foreign Office. And I think this also goes back to your what you were just saying about this German Islam policy that really tried to court the Muslim world in a way. And he actually kind of used that against them as well.
So in 1933, the Nazis come to power. And the expectation was that the Nazis would be radically racist against Arabs, and that they would persecute Arabs or Muslim immigrants just as they persecuted Jews. This expectation was clear to anybody who had made the effort of reading Mein Kampf, for example. Yeah, if we look into that book by Adolf Hitler, there's vile, disgusting, obscene slurs against Arabs. There's passages where Hitler writes that the colonially subjugated peoples of the global South deserve to be, to feel the boot and the heel of the Europeans. And really, it would have been expectable, or the thing to expect was that the Nazis would end this friendly politics towards Arabs. And yet, to everybody's surprise, they did the opposite. In 1933, our protagonist, Dr. Helmy, is working in this hospital, and the brown shirts of the Nazis, the SR, Hitler's thugs and muscle, come into the hospital one morning, and they go from room to room, and they grab Jewish doctors and take them outside and put them on a van and take them to a prison where they're brutally beaten. And Dr. Helmy is afraid for his life and is expecting that he will suffer the same fate as his Jewish colleagues. But to his own surprise, he is spared. And quite to the contrary, what the Nazis do is they tell him, not to worry, you are our friend, we want to stay friends with you. And they even promote him. They give him one of the jobs that has now been freed by a Jewish doctor who's been taken away. So the Nazis really make an effort, and this is one example, but there's a lot of other examples, to be on the good side of the Arabs, because they already are thinking strategically that the Arab lands in the south of Europe, so North Africa, but also the Muslim populations of Southeast Europe, of the Bosnia, for instance, or Azerbaijan, that these territories would be easier to conquer for Germans if Germans were perceived as friends of the local population, as liberators from British or French colonialism or Soviet colonialism. So this was the naive hope of the Nazi regime, and this is what drove them and motivated them to swallow their own racism and pretend that they had an inkling of sympathy for the Arabs. It's bizarre if we look at the reasoning given by the Nazis. When in 1935 the Nuremberg laws were passed, the racist anti-Semitic laws which defined that Jews and so-called Aryans were not allowed to have relations with one another, the Nazis made a huge effort to explain in somehow logical terms that the Arabs would be considered like akin to German blood. And the reasoning was that, well, in the First World War, we were kind of on the same side as the Turkish, so they're kind of close to us. And also the Arabs are a noble race. And so at the end of the day, the Arabs were subsumed under the same category as Germans and as Aryans, all just to protect this ideology or this strategic goal of gaining them as as allies for Germany. Now, the thing is, the real life de facto Arabs in Berlin were far too clever for this. These young gentlemen who had been living in Berlin and enjoying Berlin nightlife, and who had married German, often Jewish German women, who had Jewish colleagues and many Jewish friends, they were not going to fall for Nazi propaganda from one day to another. And this hope by the Nazis that if you give them a good job and if you're kind to them, then they will kind of follow you blindly, was naive. And our protagonist, Dr. Helmy, was somebody who played along, who pretended to buy the Nazis' propaganda, and who made the Nazis very happy by pretending that he kind of accepted their leadership and that he liked Hitler or whatever. But in reality, he used the freedoms which the Nazis gave him to continue to support his Jewish friends and the people who he owed a debt of gratitude to.
So tell us a little bit more about the Jewish friends and the Boas family that he gets acquainted with, and the kind of the start of his relationship with Anna.
So this is the other protagonist of the story, a girl called Anna. At the beginning of the story, she's maybe 11 or 12 years old. And Dr. Helmy is called to her family. They live in the center of Berlin. The family runs a fruit and vegetable store. And Dr. Helmy treats the grandmother like as a general practitioner. The reason why the family is very, very friendly to him, the Jewish family gives him tips and kind of really wants to have his sympathies, is that they're desperate for a doctor. In 1935, the Nazis ban Jewish doctors from practicing medicine. They're not even allowed to call themselves doctor anymore. The word is taken away from them. They're not allowed to access proper medicine anymore. And at the same time, Jewish patients are not allowed to go to so-called Aryan doctors. So if you're Jewish in those days and you're in need of medical attention, it's the best thing that you can find is a doctor who doesn't fall in neither of the categories, who's not treated as Aryan and not treated as Jewish. So to find a Muslim doctor who is friendly to the Jews is great for them. So this is how he meets these patients, how he meets this Jewish family, and how over time he becomes a trusted confidant of the family. They turn towards him whenever they have a question, whenever they're afraid. He works in a hospital which is now no longer a Jewish hospital, but which is now a hospital full of Nazi doctors, and he has Nazi colleagues, and he knows what they're talking about, and he has some insight into the regime. And he helps the family by giving them advice. And then persecution of the Jews becomes more radical and more brutal. And in 1941, the Nazis begin deportations in Berlin. That is to say, Jewish families receive letters in which they are told, you should be at this and this place next morning, and you should bring a suitcase to work in the East. We all know that the Nazis employed lies in order to meet less resistance. So in this moment of fear and of confusion, the family turned towards their confidant, towards Dr. Helmy, and he convinced them forcefully in a few hours of debate to not buy those lies and to go into hiding. And he convinces the grandmother of little Anna to, well, go to ground, to hide in an empty apartment. He helps the mother and her stepfather to find some kind of way to survive. And at the end, Anna, who is now 16 years old, has to find somehow some way of hiding or of saving her life from deportation. And for her, he has a very unique and very creative idea how she can hide. And when I was researching for this book and I was plowing through the archives and I found what this idea was, this is the moment in my research when I understood that this story doesn't just warrant a newspaper article, but this is stuff for a book, because it is so magical and it is so original. He hid this 16-year-old girl not in an empty apartment like Anne Frank, or behind a double door or behind a fake cupboard. Instead, he decided to hide her in plain sight and to take her into his house and to tell his neighbors and to tell his patients that she was a member of his family, that she was his niece. In other words, that she was also Muslim and Arab. And so from that day on, a Jewish girl named Anna became a Muslim girl in Berlin and continued to live without the yellow star, without well, being treated as a Jew, and playing essentially a kind of theater, a kind of masquerade to trick the Nazis in everyday life.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in the book you say the veil is almost like a cloak of invisibility, or like it's a way for her to hide. It also made me think of a story of women nowadays, Dutch women who converted to Islam and start wearing the veil, and then people are surprised that they speak Dutch. Like then they completely become something else for people who get in touch with them. So it was a very clever way of doing this.
And in those days, the Germans were, of course, much less acquainted with Arabic culture or with Islam, so it was even more exotic to them, and it was even more maybe blinding. So a person with a veil, with a hijab, was so exotic, and that maybe it kind of distracted the attention from any other features that she had. I mean, in fact, Anna, even though she was a very talented and very creative girl, she didn't speak a word of Arabic. So it's incredible to me how she pulled off this this act. But again, this was a day when Germans weren't familiar with the sound of Arabic. It was much easier to trick people into believing that you are Arab, that you're from an Arabic family, than it would be today.
And unless you encounter other Arabs, because there's this tense scene also when they get called up.
Yeah, so the more lies you tell, the more, the deeper you get into the woods, the more chances you give the others to challenge your lies, and then you have to cover up your lies with new lies. And so this is really the story that I tell in the book. With each chapter, it becomes more daring and more fragile, because yeah, it becomes more complicated to keep to sustain these lies. And as you say, there is not just this one Arab, there's not just the one doctor, there's an Arab community, and within that community, there's a bunch of people who are helpful, who want to support a Jewish girl. So it's not just the one protagonist of my story, but he has a number of friends who support him and who help him out. But on the other hand, there's also Arabs who side with the Nazis, and wholeheartedly so. So most prominently and most notoriously, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was, perhaps you could say, the political figurehead of the Arabs in what was then Palestine, and who was from a very early day an admirer of Hitler. So all through the 1930s, he'd been someone who sent telegrams to Berlin congratulating the Nazis on their political successes. He was somebody who, when Jewish refugees arrived on the shores of Palestine in the 1930s and early 1940s, who welcomed Jews with swastikas that he painted on walls. And he was somebody who parroted the Nazis' kind of obscene anti-Semitic rhetoric and adopted that into Arabic. So things like calling Jews parasites, or likening them with bacteria, that kind of talk was introduced into the Arabic language by him. And he got into trouble with the Brits, and he had to flee Palestine. And in 1941, hiding in women's clothes, he fled via Istanbul to Berlin, and he became a guest of honor for the Nazis. So he set up camp in Berlin. He got a big team of people who worked for him. The Nazis gave him a luxury suite in a very luxurious hotel, and they put him to work as a propagandist for the Nazis' political cause. So what the Mufti of Jerusalem started doing was producing radio broadcasts in the Arabic language to rally support in North Africa and Arabic-speaking countries and populations. And this was a dangerous person. This was somebody who was very serious about the annihilation and the murder of Jews. And well, I tell the story. I don't want to give spoilers. I don't want to give everything away, but I will say that one of his closest, his right-hand man, essentially, secretly worked together with the protagonist of my story, with Dr. Helmy, and secretly helped to save Jews and to save Anna. And he did so by taking documents and letterheads of the Mufti of Jerusalem and kind of well, sort of forging the signature, or forging the approval of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And there are moments where the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and Dr. Helmy and Anna, where they touch and where they come very close, and where it was very tense.
So indeed, in the end, we wouldn't discuss in detail the whole book, because then it would be giving everything away. But Anna is saved, and you eventually visit her family in the States, and then Dr. Helmy's family in Egypt. So can you tell me a little bit more about those journeys? Which one came first, and how did that go?
Yeah, so first was my visit to Egypt, and it was important for me to go there with an open mind, because well, my initial reaction, and maybe that's the same reaction that some of you in the audience had, my initial reaction was to be taken aback by their reluctance to accept this honor from Jerusalem. And I thought that, you know, how can you play politics in such a moment when it's a purely humanitarian gesture to honor your ancestor? And yet, you know, I thought it would be worthwhile to listen to their story and to maybe learn something about their perspective. And I spent 4 evenings with the family. I came there with huge respect and with well, patience, and try to gain their respect also. And the explanation which they gave actually initially made a lot of sense. They explained to me that, okay, first of all, Yad Vashem is not a independent entity, but it's a government agency of the state of Israel. And of course, Yad Vashem is a government agency which pursues government policies. We know that the head of Yad Vashem is appointed by the Prime Minister of Israel. In the 1980s, Yad Vashem pursued a quite aggressively nationalist narrative with the way that it kind of placed the Holocaust in a larger story of the Jewish people, and in the way that it well, advocated for Zionism as the answer. This is not the case today. Today, the style of Yad Vashem is a lot more moderate and a lot more nuanced. But yeah, I took the point as a fair point that they pointed out Yad Vashem is not neutral. And to travel to Yad Vashem and to allow Yad Vashem to take pictures with you and to put you on a pedestal means to play along with somebody else's political game, and maybe it's wise to stay clear of that. So I could respect that perspective that they gave. And then also they made the argument that, look, Yad Vashem isn't honoring people for saving people. They're honoring people for saving Jews. And that's a bit of a different thing. That means that you think it's particularly worthy of praise if somebody saved a Jewish person. And the thing that the family in Egypt told me was that, look, our ancestor didn't care if the girl was Jewish. This was just an innocent teenager whom he wanted to save. And it really doesn't do him justice posthumously to claim that this was an act of solidarity with the Jewish people or with Jews. This was this kind of distorts the nature of his deed. And again, I have to say, I can respect that logic. But then we got more acquainted and more open with one another, and a few more espressos were drunk and a few more cigarettes were smoked. And at one point, the family told me, you know what? The amazing thing about Hitler is what he did for aviation. The technology that Hitler brought. Okay, that's a bit hard for me to swallow. And then they continued. And you know what? The terrible thing that Hitler did, and the thing why it was important that Hitler was stopped, this is that Hitler was bad for the Jews. This led to the Jews coming to Palestine. This was bad for the Arabs. That's why Hitler was bad. So I kind of went home that night, well, with a bitter feeling. This is the political reality we live in today. The story that I tell with the book and that I try to well, bring back to life can be a bridge and can kind of challenge the prejudices that we have today of Arabs and Jews being incompatible, but it's a different reality that we live in today. And the more recent history, the history of the Middle East conflict overshadows a lot of the older history, and really shapes the way in which people today see their own history, unfortunately.
But they were proud of this story as well, right? And of Mohammed Helmy.
They were proud to some degree. They were, I think, also cautious to some degree to not be associated with Jews publicly. This was quite clear to me. We have to know that present day Egypt, even though Egypt is one of the longest standing peace contracts with the state of Israel, nonetheless, on the street and in everyday life, the attitude towards Israel and towards the Jews, which is, you know, the two words are interchangeable in the Arabic language, is absolutely toxic. And for a person who is visible in public life to be associated with Jews, or even for the rumor to be floated that somebody has Jewish people in his family, that can mean the end of a career. And there have been cases in recent time when politicians have really been, well, who their careers have been destroyed by people claiming that they have something to do with Jews. So this is a reality that this family that I visited didn't create this reality themselves. It's a reality they have to live in. Now, I wouldn't claim to know where they stand in the depth in their heart. I don't think that I'm somebody who they would share that with. But I think I should give them a little credit that they don't move freely, and they can't talk freely about these things, and that maybe not everything can be taken 100% at face value. But that's the tragic situation that we're in right now. And I spent an afternoon, this was really fascinating for me, with an old member of the family, also a doctor, a professor of medicine, who, well, we strolled through old Cairo, and there's a beautiful part of Cairo which used to be the Jewish quarter, where there's synagogues, and we stood in front of a synagogue which is called after Maimonides, whom you all know as a great philosopher and a great thinker of Jewish, well, enlightenment. At least he was rediscovered in the era of Jewish enlightenment. And I stood there in front of a synagogue which today is just a ruins, where there's rubbish piling up, and the synagogue is empty. There are practically no Jews left in Egypt today. There is practically no Jewish life left. And the doctor said, you know, Maimonides, we call him Ibn Maimun, because Ibn Maimun is the Arabic name, and this is the name that he actually went by in real life. Maimonides wrote his Jewish theology in Arabic, which was his mother tongue. This is a time when Jewish culture and Arabic culture were much closer, much more intertwined than we know today, or we like to think today.
And on the other side, you also went to the US to visit Anna's family. And how was that experience?
So that was very different because, well, I'm Jewish myself and I'm from a Western country. So to travel to New York and to visit a Jewish family kind of didn't feel like a departure from my political comfort zone. And so really it's more of a self-reflective exercise and looking at my own cultural well, heritage or where I come from. And yeah, I was a bit saddened to see that the family, on the one hand, has great appreciation, of course, for the courage by Dr. Helmy. There was a big family dinner, and the daughter of Anna unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but her daughter said to a whole room full of family members, yeah, several generations, kids running around, and she said to them, none of you would be here without Dr. Helmy. Without Dr. Helmy, we would all not exist. So there is, on the one hand, this great appreciation, but on the other hand, Anna and Helmy were the only people from these two families on two ends of the globe who stayed in contact after the war. Yeah, when Anna had survived the war, thanks to Dr. Helmy, and had emigrated to the US, she wrote letters with Dr. Helmy. She even visited him and even took her daughter to visit him to see this man that they owe so much. But that's it. Unfortunately, the rest of the family never used the opportunity to get into contact, to well, have an exchange with the other side. And yeah, I really thought that was sad. And also to realize that why did Yad Vashem only give this honor in 2013? Why did it take so many years? And the reason is that the family never made an effort to raise the issue with Yad Vashem. Instead, it was somebody in Berlin who, in the early 2000s, wrote a letter to Yad Vashem. Somebody who had no personal connection to the issue at all. So yeah.
Well, thank you. I would like to, I have one more question for you, and then I will open it up to the audience. But I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how these kind of stories of this micro history, this really window into the past, what can that tell us about the creation of historical narratives and about where that leads us to today?
So something that became really clear to me, coming from a Jewish background myself, is that Judaism and Islam so similar and so closely connected, and very basically, yeah, the idea of kosher and the idea of halal they're a little different, but the concept is the same basically, and it's this concept. The idea that food is something to be discussed in religion is a concept that, for example, in Christianity is completely unknown. Also, the idea of circumcision of boys, or to be more theological, the idea of a very clear monotheistic focus on one deity. These are concepts where Jews and Muslims share a lot. And it really, if you look at the three Abrahamite religions, including Christianity, then Christianity is always the odd one out. So really, on a religious level, it totally makes sense that these two would get along well together. And also on a historical level, yeah, if you look at the way that Jews were treated in Christian Europe for many centuries, it makes sense that Jews and Muslims would gravitate towards one another more strongly than with Christianity. Well, what overlaps and what distracts from that is politics, is the Middle East conflict, which I would argue is not a religious conflict. The conflict in the Middle East over territory of Palestine/Israel is a conflict over territory, and there is very rational reasoning why there's two groups that are interested in that territory. And if by some like magic trick, religion disappeared off the minds of people, then that conflict would not be solved. It would continue to exist just as it did before, because for Jews, this is a place of refuge and a place to escape centuries of persecution and to gain self-determination. And for Arabs, in many places and in many villages, it's the country of their forefathers, and it's a territory that they don't want to yield. So this kind of not really cultural and not really religious conflict, because it plays geographically in the Holy Land and in a territory that is so rich in history, it's been styled as this great religious conflict, and that really doesn't do very much to clarify, and it does a lot to obfuscate the realities of this conflict. And it makes it easier for us to, and I say us, and meaning the Jewish community also, for us to foster prejudices against the other side, and to kind of look down upon them culturally. And I think that's wrong, and I think that's something that where we should that we're better than that, and we should make the effort to look into our own history and to look into 20th century history to learn. I realize, and this is kind of the motivation for me to publish this book and to present it to different audiences, I realize that this memory doesn't really change present day realities, which are often grim. And I've written a whole book about modern day Islamic anti-Semitism, or anti-Semitism within Muslim communities. So there's not, I'm not here to downplay present day problems in any way. And I realized that remembering how good things were in the 1920s doesn't kind of magically make modern day problems go away. But my hope is that at least this gives us the hope, and this allows us to imagine that things can change for the better again. If as recently as 3 generations ago, Jews and Muslims didn't see one another as opposites and as enemies and as incompatible, then what's to stop us from imagining that in 1, 2, 3 generations, we can be there again?
That's a hopeful note to end on anyway. Thank you for bearing with me and my questions. And I will hand it over to David, who I think will moderate the discussion from the people who want to say something. You're also free to say something in the chat, by the way, if you don't want to speak. And then I will.
I think actually the chat is not active for participants, so please use the Q&A.
Sorry, the Q&A.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this wonderful discussion, and thanks also for this wonderful book, Ronan. I also really enjoyed reading it, and I don't know if I could take the liberty of just a really short comment before the discussion starts. It's just it's interesting to me, the reference you made early on about the romanticization of the, Sephardic Jewish past in Muslim Spain, and thinking about the fact that, this scene in Weimar-era Berlin between Muslims and Jews was unfolding, with that same neo-Moorish dome that we all know today, as a landmark of Berlin, in sight. So I mean, it's a very clear example of people kind of searching the past for inspiration of how things, how we want the future to turn out. It's a sort of happening on two levels here, right? There's your book, in a way where we can mine the past for maybe a different way of viewing things, and there's also this view in 19th century Germany that, the enlightened rulers of the Umayyad Empire in Spain, could be a model for Germany and its Jews. But anyway, we have, there were a couple names, but now I see that Francis Galela has a question. So Francis, I hope that you're listening, and I'm going to click a button that says allow to talk, and you may need to unmute your microphone. So Francis, are you there?
Yeah, here I am. Do you
Go
have
ahead.
me now?
We hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for this presentation. This is very, very interesting, and it's so heartwarming that those two different ethnicities came together at such a crucial time, with benefits for all, especially the little girl. Okay, having said that, I'm particularly interested in a comment the author made about the hundreds of years prior treatment of Jewish people in Europe by non-Jewish people, primarily Christians, of course. And it reminded me of a piece I read about the Crusades, where the Polish knights gathered in order to go to the Holy Lands and free the Holy Lands. And if I remember my story correctly, the first thing they did was raid Jewish neighborhoods in Poland to punish Jews, having nothing whatsoever to do with going to the Holy Lands. But that was part of the mindset of the time. Here's a people that we can discriminate against and harm, no questions asked. I wonder if the author is familiar with that, or maybe can expand on that a little bit.
So the role that Jews had in Europe, and this really applies to Poland just as it does to France or to Germany, was that of the scapegoat through many centuries. Scapegoat for political leaders and also for religious leaders. So, for instance, if there was a problem with the harvest, there was some reason why the harvest was bad, and the people were suffering hunger, or there was some kind of insecurity within the population, then it was it was kind of a good idea it served a function for political leaders to say, you know what, I have an explanation for this harvest problem. It's the Jews who poisoned the wells, or it's the Jews with their Jew magic behind the scenes who are to blame. Why was that a good idea? Because the people who were afraid and who were insecure now were not afraid and insecure anymore. Rather, they were angry and very secure about what they wanted to do, which was to go and punish the Jews who were living on the outskirts or on the outside of town. And so this distracted from mistakes that leaders had made, and it kind of served to bring together and to close the ranks of the Christian majority. And the same was the case when the Black Death, the plague, came to Europe. People didn't understand why there was this illness, which was so deadly and so widespread. They didn't know about hygiene and fleas and rats and all these things that we know about today. So the easy thing for political leaders in those days was to say, you know what, I have an explanation. It's the Jews once again. And if you're frustrated and if you're grieving and if you're angry, you know, you can take all your negative feelings and take it out on the Jews. And that's really something that well continued and became, well, tradition isn't a good word, is not a good word, but it became like a habit, a bad habit of Christian European culture. And also it was employed as this mechanism was employed by Christian leaders of faith, as you just alluded to. For instance, in the time of the Crusades, but also all through the Middle Ages, particularly during the time of Easter, of the Christian holiday of Easter. Christians were sent on pogroms, blaming Jews for the murder of Christ or for blood libel. And again, this served church leaders to distract from their own real life shortcomings and to kind of foster a feeling of togetherness against this other, which was the Jew.
I have another question real quick. Not a question, rather a comment, I'm sorry. As an indication how widespread these feelings were, we can look to one of Shakespeare's plays, Merchant of Venice, and the persecution or possible persecution of Shylock. And in one sentence, Shylock says, if I remember this right, coming off the top of my head, something like, are we not the same? When you prick us, do we not bleed? And it was kind of a plead to everyone saying, look, we're the same as you. We're not different. And that always struck, I read that in high school, but it always struck me as a very powerful thing to say. We are like you. When you prick us, do we not bleed? Do you have any comment on that or any?
Yeah, that is a beautiful and very succinct phrase by Shakespeare. On the other hand, Shakespeare himself wasn't free from anti-Semitic tropes, and a lot can be said about the Merchant of Venice and whether that really was whom that play really did service in the end. But I guess my point is that if you ask people, academics, what are the origins of anti-Semitism and why the Jews? Some will give you an answer which is rooted in the Bible and which is, Jesus' story and the origins of the Christian faith. And I take a different perspective. I would argue that it's not such an intellectual story after all. It doesn't have that much to do with theology. It has a lot to do with politics and with feelings. And with this very human, I'm sad to say, very human mechanism that it's easier to hate than to fear, and it's tempting to have a scapegoat, and it's a mechanism, a psychological mechanism that I'm sure works in other parts of the world where it's employed against other minorities, but in my part of the world, in Europe. Unfortunately, historically, it's been employed against the Jews.
Sophie, are there any questions in the Q&A you think we should?
There are also a couple of comments. I will just quickly go through some. One that says, I take the author's point, but the terms for Jewish and Israeli are not literally the same in Arabic, which of course is true, so it's good to say that. And there are many Arabs who do not oppose Jews or those who have Jewish relatives, not to mention there are a lot of Jewish Arabs. This is not to say that prejudice or conflation of Jewish people and the Israeli state or Zionist politics and does not happen, because that also does.
Well, it's a lot more. I'm thankful for that comment and pointing out that these things are much more faceted than is possible to say in one sentence. But I mean, the fact that in Egypt, if you talk about Israel and Israeli politics, you say Al Yahud, and everybody understands what you mean and which country you mean. that's just what I wanted to point out. Yeah.
I see. And there was a question from Shep Ronon. I think this would make an amazing movie. Is that being considered?
It's a great idea, and I totally share that sentiment. If you have any friends in Hollywood, please send them my way. No, but on a serious note, okay, so I think this story is really, that's the reason why I wrote this book, is really worth sharing. And there's a great value in bringing this story to people. In Germany, for instance, it's been immensely impactful on youths from immigrant families. Yeah, so we have an immigration in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, which was very strong from Arabic, but also Arab countries, but also from Turkey. And today, Germany, just like France, just like Great Britain, has a large minority of Muslim heritage. And one of the problems that we find is that whenever school teachers tell kids about the Holocaust and about German history, there's a big chunk of kids of the class which just says, well, okay, that's not my story. What do I have to do with that? You know, I'm Turkish. It doesn't really apply to my own biography and history. And we have found that it's immensely impactful and helpful if you can say to those kids, look, but there are Muslims who played a role in the Holocaust. Of course there were Muslims, yeah? And let me tell you some stories about them. And then here's a story which you can even be proud of, which you can even identify with, which you can take a page out of that story and apply that to improving present day coexistence.
I think in Europe there's a lot of idea that the history of Muslims in Europe starts in the 60s and the 70s, but that's very clearly not the case, and it's good to continue.
Unfortunately, yeah, meaning the German public or the European public, France, Great Britain is the same. We often have this idea or this stereotype that Arabs and Muslims came wearing like dirty jeans and mechanics clothes, yeah, and there's not really the perception that they came also wearing doctor's cloaks and ties, and it's important to kind of raise awareness of that. And
it's bypassing a lot of colonial history as well. The Netherlands was the biggest Muslim empire at some point with Indonesia, so it's, yeah. Anyway, there was also a question another question about your visit to Egypt, whether Dr. Helmy's relatives were aware that you were Jewish.
I didn't advertise, no. No, I made a point of not talking about myself and trying not to become the story. And I was aware of the fact that that would be a problem, and that I would make conversations more complicated by adding that issue. So no.
I see another very interesting question at the most recent one. Will the book be translated into Hebrew? And I guess I would add Arabic.
That's a great question. So the book has actually been very well received in Israel, despite only being published in English. But the public in Israel is very open to reading English, so that's not an issue. Haaretz, Yediot Achronot, the Times of Israel have all run big reviews, and the story has been very well publicized. The Arab world is different. In the Arab world, it really matters whether you are published in Arabic or not. And I'm thrilled, I hope people can see this, that it really just came out in Arabic. Just
congratulations.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about this. I have yet to hear from Egypt how the reception is going, but I really look forward to that. I think there's some valuable discussions that could be triggered.
Yeah, so when we were planning this event, my colleague Magda Robel, who works on our team putting programs together, informed me that the story of Dr. Helmy and Anna it is actually featured quite heavily in a new Holocaust museum that's in Dubai. So it's interesting. Were you aware of that, or had you been contacted about that?
I hadn't been contacted, but I heard that there was a book fair in Dubai where my book was presented quite recently, and where at least publishers and intellectuals were debating. So maybe that spawned this museum exhibition.
Well, give the audience one more chance. Is there anyone who'd like to ask a question by raising their hands? I guess, Sophie, I'll give you the honor of the last question, if you have one up your sleeve. Well, it looks like we actually. Oh no, someone was shy. They raised their hands and then lowered it. Here we go. We have Karen Newwald. So we'll get at least one more question from the audience. Karen, are you there?
Yes. So can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. I don't know. Right now I'm not on the video, but I don't know how to get there real quick. So.
Well, we can hear you just fine.
I just wanted to say I really found this presentation totally fascinating. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but I'm the daughter of people that fled Nazi Germany, and I just find this story so rewarding. You know, we hear about Anne Frank, and here we hear another story that should get equal billing as far as I'm concerned. So I wanted to thank the author and also thank the LBI for having this presentation. I just found this phenomenal.
Oh, thanks. Did you have a question?
No, that
okay.
Just wanted to acknowledge that I think this was a really great presentation.
Oh, thanks for chiming in. I agree.
That's really kind. So the book came out in English, as has been mentioned. It came out in Arabic. I can already recommend both. And yeah, I mean, the comparison with Anne Frank, of course, the stories are very different, but Anne Frank's family came closer together under the pressure from the outside. The Jewish family in my story did not, and rather it was necessary for Dr. Helmy as an outsider to help the teenage girl. But maybe where there's a little parallel is that these are two strong girls. Anne Frank, who was so smart and who kind of shared her thoughts with her diary, and who questioned and who had all these ideas about the world. And here we have Anna, which really at the end of the day, that to me is the most impressive, who turned out to be such a talented and fearless actor. Yeah, in the sense of the art, the craft of acting. She would go to work in the doctor's practice of Dr. Helmy in the morning. She would accompany him with her veil, pretending to be Arabic, not speaking a word of Arabic. And when they arrived in the doctor's practice, they would play this kind of theater also to the patients, yeah, to the German patients. And sometimes Helmy would shout something to her in Arabic, and she would respond, yeah, so, pretending that she understood what he said, just to give the illusion. So yeah, I wish I would have had a chance to interview her. I wish I hadn't come too late, because I think she was really a fascinating person.
I see that our board member Joan Lessing also has her hand up, so I'm going to click the button for Joan to speak. Joan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I just wanted to comment that Anna's family might not have known about the righteous Gentile road, or whatever it's called, at Yad Vashem. There are a lot of people Jewish people, Christian people, whomever, who actually are not aware that this even exists. You know, when you said that her family didn't do anything about it.
Yeah, it's possible. I agree. On the other hand, this is a family whose story is very special and who were very aware of the fact that they were saved by somebody's courage. So I kind of find it hard to imagine that it never came up over all the years, over all the decades. This is a large family, a family who, well, cherished their Jewish heritage, who went to Jewish schools. It kind of seems that they're like avoiding an issue if that never came up. But
I just thought they might not have been aware of the option.
I can't say for sure. So it's possible that that's an explanation, absolutely.
Thanks, John. Okay. I do see one more question that for Ronan in the chat about your Fritz Bauer biography. Will that be translated into English?
It's already been translated into English. I recommend it. Maybe if not everybody knows what it's about, I'll give you a two-sentence syllabus. So you all know the story of Adolf Eichmann, the logistics guy of the Holocaust, the person who organized the trains to Auschwitz and who fled to Argentina after the war and who hid under an assumed name and pretended to be somebody else and evaded justice in this way. And who was then kidnapped by the Mossad, by the Israeli Secret Service, and brought to Jerusalem and famously put on trial in Jerusalem, a trial which was immensely impactful for the Israeli society, which opened a lot of doors and started a lot of conversations within the Israeli society, and which was famously portrayed by Hannah Arendt in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem. But what is not known is what is that behind this story of this kidnapping was a solitary German Jewish jurist who sat in Frankfurt, Germany, and he was the first person to receive this information of Eichmann's whereabouts. And rather than pass the information on to other German prosecutors, German police, German state bureaucrats, he decided that that was too much of a risk. He had experienced that he was, as a German Jew, he was surrounded by so many old Nazis who had returned after the war to positions of power within the justice system, within the courts, within the police. And he had experienced many a time that that these people warned their old Nazi friends and buddies whenever they were about to be captured, that he decided there was no point in pursuing Eichmann the legal way, and that he decided instead to inform the Israeli Secret Service and to do it in an illegal way. And that encapsulates the character of this man. He was completely isolated in the German justice system, and he was courageous to a degree that I can only admire. He changed the course of history in several instances, and he was not only instrumental in bringing Eichmann to trial in Jerusalem and thus breaking the silence about the Holocaust to a degree in Israeli society, but he was also instrumental in breaking the silence about the Holocaust in the German post-war society, where for very different reasons, people were not interested in speaking. And there was a strong sense of keeping things hush and not discussing and not confronting history. He fought against this and rebelled against this and was successful in bringing the Auschwitz camp guards, 20 of them, to court in Frankfurt in the 1960s, which was a huge deal and which really captured the attention of a young generation, which then in the 1960s started to question their parents and their grandparents. So this was somebody who really shaped Germany a little bit for the better, somebody whom I immensely admire and whom I wrote a biography about. And you can get it. It was published by Indiana University Press in 2020 in their series German Jewish Cultures. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I think we've been going almost an hour and a half, and that's probably a good time to wrap it up. But Ronen Steinke, Sophie Spaan, thank you both so much for this conversation. Thank you, Ronan, for your book. Thank you all for spending this little bit of the afternoon or evening, wherever you are, with us. And we'll see you next time. We'll send you an email with a link to the recording and links to all the relevant books and articles and discount codes. So thanks all. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Please like this video and subscribe for more content from the Leo Baeck Institute.